Hi guys, in this video I'm going to show you how to set up Hsqldb for use with Java. Hsqldb is an SQL database similar to MySQL, but because it's written in Java, it provides really easy interoperability with Java applications. So the first step is if you go to the Hsqldb website, which I've opened here, this has all of the documentation, and there's also a link on the front page to the Maven repository. So then I click through the Maven repository and the latest version, and then you can download the jar file, which has everything you need. You can see it's not a big download, just 1.5 megabytes. Now I've already downloaded it, and I put it into a folder called Databases on my C drive. The reason I put it in a folder in the root like this is just to save a bit of typing and make it easy to find, but of course you can put it anywhere you like. So I've saved the jar file into that folder, and then I've opened the Windows command prompt inside that folder, and you can see that the jar file is in there. Now I can run the jar file just using java-jar and then the name of the jar file. And if you run it that way, then you're going to get this application, which is a convenient user interface for communicating with the database and executing SQL queries. But we don't have a database yet. So actually, the first step is to start Hsqldb in server mode, the idea here is that we're running Hsqldb, and it will communicate over the network with any client program that wants to use the database. Now, we can run the client program and the database server on the same computer, and in that case, we'll just be using localhost as the domain name, so that we're connecting through the loopback interface. So we're connecting to a program running on the same machine as our client program. So to run the database in server mode, we write Java and then CP, which stands for class path, and then put the name of your jar. Now we have to write the name of the class that we want to run. So we're not running the default application, but instead we're running a different class, and the class we want to run is org.hsqldb.server with a capital S. Now that will start the server, and we need to say where we want the database to be stored. So you do that by typing --database. Now I'm going to store the database in the directory that I'm running the jar from, so I don't need to actually specify a different directory, but I still need to write a name for the database, so I'm going to call this test. Now when I press enter, and it started the database server, you can see here the file name, and I could start the database with an alias, which allows me to host multiple databases on the same server. But here I haven't done that, so the alias is blank. Now I'm going to leave that running in the background. Basically, we need to leave the server running for as long as we want to use the database. Now, if I start another command line, and I'll go to the same path. Now this time I'm going to, you can see there, by the way, that it's created some files to store the data. But what I'm going to do is now run the jar as an application, and we'll try connecting to the database or connecting to the database server that I just started. So we go to type and choose HSQL Database Engine Server. Now the driver is the Jdbc Driver. This just means the Java database. I guess C stands for connectivity or connection or something like that. So this is a standard protocol for connecting to SQL databases with Java. Now the URL is, like I mentioned before, localhost, so this computer. And because I didn't use an alias for the database, I don't need to put anything after the slash. Now the user is SA, which is basically the administrator account, and I don't need a password at the moment because there isn't one set up. So I'll just click OK. And now I've connected to the database, and I can run SQL queries by entering them in this little window here. So let's create a table as an example. So I'm going to create a table, we'll call it messages, and we'll have one field in the table called text, and it will be a text field with maximum of 80 characters. So then click on execute SQL, and that's fine. It's saying I didn't update any rows, I just created a table. Now I'm going to insert some data into the messages table that I just created. So again, execute SQL, and then I'll insert another message. Okay, now we can run a query against the database. So if I do select star from messages, execute SQL, and you can see there are the two messages that I inserted into the database. Okay, so now I'm going to close down this client user interface, and we'll try getting those messages out of the database using Java. So I've got Eclipse open down here, and I've already written the code. So just having a look at the elements in the code. First of all, we have to load the database driver. So that's what this line is doing. Now, Jdbc, like I mentioned before, is a protocol which Java can use to communicate with databases. And in this case, we want to use the Jdbc driver for the Hsqldb package. Now, we need to have the Hsqldb library added to the class path. So you can do that by just drag and drop Hsqldb into your project. And then once it's in your project, you right click and go to build path and add to build path. Obviously, this is already on my build path, so I don't have the add, I have remove instead. But when you first copy it over, it's going to be in your project, and then right click, go to build path, add to build path. Now it's available for your application, and then you can load the driver using this command. Now once the driver is loaded, I'm calling this test function. This is what's going to perform the query against the database. And when we're performing a query against the database, it's possible that there will be an SQL exception, so I've marked this method as potentially throwing an exception. If it does throw an exception, then basically I'm just allowing the program to crash with a runtime exception. Okay, so then with the database, I'm creating a connection like this. So this is using the driver manager to get a connection. This URL is the same URL that we used in the app that I ran earlier on to connect to the database. Again, if you have an alias for your database, you'll need to put the name of the database after the slash. But since I didn't set an alias, then I can just put localhost / and that's enough. This is the username, which is SA, and again, I haven't set a password, so I've just left the password field blank. Now I create a statement, and in this case, the statement is just going to be a text query. So I write my SQL command as text inside the quotation marks, and I'm just selecting a bunch of records from the messages table. Now that's going to return a result set, and the result set is something that you can iterate through. Call the next method, which will check if there's another record, and then if so, it will move to the next record, and if not, then it's going to return false, which will end this loop. So then that gives me the next record. And then to get the data from a record, I call the result set, and then one of the get methods and I have to specify the type of data that I'm getting, and this will be the name of the field. So remember that I created a messages table and the field was called text, and that of course is a string, so then I'm going to get that data as a string and print it on the screen. So I've just put a new line on the end of that. And now if I run it, we should get the messages that I inserted into the database earlier. There we go. So that gives me 2 messages. Now, let's say that we wanted to select particular items. Instead of using just a statement, you can also use something called a prepared statement. Just going to do a quick search on the internet for that because I don't remember all of the methods. But the advantage of using a prepared statement is that you can compile your SQL with particular parameters in it that you can substitute later on. So this example gives you an indication of why it's useful. We create the prepared statement first of all with the SQL text, but the things that we want to adapt, depending on the situation, are represented by a question mark. And then later on, we can replace that question mark with a value by using the prepared statement method. So for example, the second question mark here needs to be an integer, and then I can set the value of the integer by using the setInt method of prepared statement. So that's definitely preferable to simply concatenating the integer onto the text for the SQL query. The reason is that, firstly, it will perform any kind of quoting that's required. So, for example, if we're trying to search for some text, that text needs to be quoted properly, and by using prepared statement and using the set commands, it's going to perform the kind of quoting that's required by the database. And then another big advantage is that it helps to protect against SQL injection attacks. So this is the type of attack which hackers can perform, where they submit values which, for example, are supposed to be inserted into the database, but where the values contain characters which might actually be passed in an unexpected way, and that would cause the database to perform actions which you wouldn't want it to perform. So if you use a prepared statement, that helps to protect you against those kinds of attacks. Okay, so guys, I hope that makes sense and that's enough to get you started working with Hsqldb. There's certainly all sorts of different things you can do with it. It's a full SQL implementation, and SQL has all sorts of features. I certainly don't know everything that Hsqldb can do, but I definitely have had a bunch of students use it with their Java projects, and they seemed really happy with its performance. So hopefully you will be happy with it as well if you decide to use it in your project work.